Imagine a man is thrown into a dark, just a suffocating well by his own brothers, and he's just left there to die in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it is the ultimate act of intimate betrayal.
Oh, absolutely. It's brutal.
Right. But now, fast forward a few decades, that exact same man is sitting in the equivalent of an ancient, gilded boardroom. He is holding absolute, unquestioned dictatorial control over the global food supply during what is basically one of the most catastrophic economic depressions in recorded history.
Yeah, the scale of it is just hard to comprehend.
It really is. And so today, we are absolutely not talking about a tearjerker soap opera. We are not looking for a heartwarming family reunion where everyone hugs it out and, the past is magically erased.
No, not at all.
We are talking about the most aggressive, brilliantly calculated corporate and geopolitical takeover in the ancient world. So, based on a completely fascinating stack of source material today, and this includes a really rigorous linguistic, textual, and macroeconomic analysis of Surah Yusuf, specifically verses 45 through 65, cross-referenced with historical records like Genesis 47, we are going to re-examine the story of Joseph, or Yusuf, through a radically different lens.
It's such an important shift in perspective for you to hear.
Yeah, so consider this your warning. We are leaving the realm of emotional folklore behind right now. We are stepping onto the floor of an ancient global superpower, and we are going to analyze Yusuf not as a victimized sibling, but as a ruthless mastermind chief economist.
I love that title from Chief Economist,
Yeah.
because it is a vital paradigm shift. When we read ancient texts, we have this profound bias toward the emotional.
We want the drama.
Exactly. We crave these character-driven arcs where the victim becomes the victor through sheer moral fortitude. But if you strip away the familiar emotional framing, if you put that to the side for a minute and look at the actual mechanics of what Yusuf did, you are looking at a literal masterclass in macroeconomics, statecraft, and international trade.
It's all structural.
Exactly. The engine driving this entire historical event isn't familial love or personal forgiveness. It is the unprecedented, terrifyingly efficient economic machine that Yusuf built in Egypt. Everything that happens with his brothers later on is really just a symptom of that machine functioning exactly as it was designed to.
And I think to understand that machine, we have to look at the hostile takeover that put him in charge in the first place. The transition from prisoner to portfolio manager. Because the way he sees his power is entirely counterintuitive.
Oh, it defies all logic.
It really does. So he is languishing in an Egyptian prison. The king of Egypt has this deeply disturbing dream, the famous sequence of the 7 fat cows being devoured by the 7 lean, emaciated cows. The king's advisors are totally baffled, but Yusuf, from his prison cell, accurately interprets it. He says it means 7 years of unprecedented agricultural abundance, followed immediately by 7 years of catastrophic apocalyptic famine.
A total economic collapse.
Right. Now, the standard Hollywood trope here is that the king is so blown away by this genius interpretation that he instantly sends a messenger to pardon the prisoner. The cell doors swing open, the prisoner rejoices, and he just runs out into the sunlight.
Yeah, that is exactly what we expect. And the king does, in fact, send a messenger to offer him a pardon. But the source text highlights a deeply calculated move here. Yusuf refuses to leave the cell.
Which is wild.
He straight up rejects the royal pardon. He tells the messenger to go back to the king and demand a full public judicial inquiry into the original scandal that put him in prison, the incident with the women cutting their hands.
He won't just take the easy way out.
No. He essentially says that he will not accept freedom if it comes as a favor or, a quiet sweeping of the past under the rug. He demands that his innocence be legally and structurally established first.
I was reading that sequence in the source, and it struck me as the ultimate executive power play.
It really is.
It's like a brilliant, highly sought-after executive being recruited to take over a failing, massively indebted Fortune 500 company. The board of directors is panicking, the stock is plummeting, and they offer him a golden parachute to step in and save them.
Millions of dollars just to sign on.
Right, and the executive looks at them and says, "No. I won't take the CEO job, and I won't accept your millions until you legally and publicly clear me of that insider trading scandal from 5 years ago. I want the SEC to issue a formal exoneration."
It's an incredible flex of leverage.
But it also begs a massive logistical question. I mean, the country is staring down the barrel of mass starvation. The clock on those 7 years of plenty is ticking. Every single day matters. Why delay his own release and the implementation of these life-saving reforms just to undergo a bureaucratic judicial review? Was it just, like, personal pride? Was he just trying to rub the king's nose in the injustice of his imprisonment?
You might think so, but if you analyze the mechanics of statecraft, it has absolutely nothing to do with personal pride.
Really?
Yeah, it is a fundamental prerequisite for the kind of economic restructuring he is about to propose. Sweeping macroeconomic reforms, like the kind necessary to survive a 7-year total agricultural collapse, they require a terrifying amount of public compliance.
Because you're asking people to give up their stuff.
Exactly. You are about to ask an entire nation to hand over their surplus wealth, to change their consumption habits, and eventually to restructure their entire concept of land ownership. You cannot implement drastic, painful, society-altering measures if the public has even a shadow of a doubt about your integrity.
Oh, I see. Because the moment he starts seizing grain or auditing the farmers, his political enemies, and an ancient royal court would be just full of them, will immediately weaponize that past scandal.
They'd be all over it.
They'll stand up in the public square and shout, like, why are we giving our hard-earned surplus crops to a convicted criminal? Why is an unpardoned felon controlling the treasury?
Precisely. A pardon implies guilt that has been forgiven. An exoneration implies that the guilt never existed in the first place. Yusuf required the latter.
That makes so much sense.
Right. So once his record is completely spotless and his innocence is publicly codified by the state, the king elevates him, declaring him Makanun Amin. This is a crucial linguistic marker in the text.
Let's unpack that. Makanun Amin.
So Makanun implies someone who is deeply rooted, firmly established, and structurally immovable. Amin means implicitly, unconditionally trusted. The king is not just giving him an honorary title, he is granting him an unassailable political foundation.
And the moment he has that Makanun Amin status, he doesn't just sit back and enjoy the luxury of the court. He makes a hyper-specific, incredibly aggressive demand. He says, put me in charge of the Khazan al-Ard,
The storehouses.
the finances, the absolute fiscal heart of the land. And his justification for this isn't just that he interpreted a dream. He says, I am Hafizun Alim, a knowledgeable guardian.
The pairing of those two specific attributes, Hafiz and Alim, is the bedrock of his economic philosophy.
Okay, break those down for us.
Sure. So Hafiz is the guardian, the protector. It represents absolute moral integrity and the unyielding defense of assets. Alim is the technical expert, the one who possesses the deep, complex, systemic knowledge of how things actually work. The text emphasizes that in a macroeconomic crisis, having one without the other is a recipe for a failed state.
Right, because if you have the Hafiz without the Alim, you have a wonderfully honest, deeply moral person who sits there guarding the grain silos with a pure heart, but they have absolutely no idea how to calculate supply chain logistics.
Of demographic distribution.
Exactly, or crop yield decay over a 7-year period. The people still starve, they just starve under a highly ethical leader.
It's well-intentioned incompetence. And conversely, if you have the Alim without the Hafiz, which, let's be honest, is the far more common historical tragedy, you have a brilliant technical economist who understands every single lever of the financial system, but possesses no moral barrier against corruption.
Oh, yeah, we've seen that movie.
Right.
Yeah.
That expert will brilliantly restructure the economy in a way that perfectly enriches themselves and their political cronies while the masses are just squeezed dry. Yusuf presents himself as the rare synthesis of both.
The moral fortress to protect the wealth, combined with the technical genius to actually manage it.
Exactly.
So he clears his name, he secures unquestioned public trust, he claims the absolute fiscal authority of the Khazan al-Ard, and he has the dual threat capability to run it. What happens when this guy actually gets his hands on the levers of power? Because he doesn't just tweak interest rates.
No, he goes way further.
He doesn't just pass a temporary stimulus package. He fundamentally rewrites the social contract of the ancient world.
He really does. The source text dives heavily into the actual mechanics of his administration during those 14 years. The text we are analyzing today, specifically cross-referencing the Quranic linguistic analysis with historical accounts like Genesis chapter 47, they detail a system that goes far beyond standard crisis management.
So what did the day-to-day look like?
Well, during the 7 years of plenty, Yusuf systematically gathered the surplus. He didn't just politely ask for it, he structurally mandated its collection. And then, when the 7 years of famine hit, he instituted a policy that permanently altered the geopolitical landscape.
Because he couldn't just give it away.
Right. He didn't just open the silos and hand out free grain indefinitely. That would have depleted the reserves instantly through panic hoarding.
People would take more than they need.
Exactly. Nor did he leave it to a free market free-for-all, where private merchants could price gouge starving citizens.
The logistics of this are wild to me. The text points out that he initiated a staggered, deeply calculated wealth transfer. First, he traded the state's grain for the people's money and liquid capital.
Yep, absorbing the cash.
And then, when the money ran out, he traded grain for their livestock, the means of production and transportation. And finally, when the livestock was gone, the people traded their land and essentially their labor to the state. He brought the entirety of the agricultural real estate of Egypt under state or pharaoh's direct control.
It is essential to understand how the source text interprets this massive centralization of power, because it frames it through a concept called rububiyat.
Rububiyat, let's dig into that.
Now, it's fascinating how the texts we're looking at today frame this historical reality. They present a really sharp critique of localized land ownership and what they term religious feudalism. The text notes with clear historical frustration that the systemic religious elite, often referred to as Hammon in these analyses to represent the priestly class, somehow managed to keep their private land holdings while the common citizens had to sell theirs to the state just to survive.
Right, and as a reminder to you listening, our job on this deep dive is to impartially report on the source's content here. Whether you look at that critique of the religious elite through a modern capitalist lens, a socialist lens, or a purely historical one, we aren't taking sides. But what is absolutely undeniable in the text is the sheer scale of the centralization taking place.
Absolutely. The centralization is the historical fact.
Right, and it forces us to look at the reality of this rububiyat concept. Because from an outsider's perspective, this looks like the ultimate totalitarian power grab, taking people's money, their cows, and their farms in exchange for food. But the text argues that this was the establishment of a mathematically rigid system of rububiyat, which is the principle that basic sustenance, the fundamental baseline of survival, is a right that must be guaranteed by the state.
That's the core of it. In a severe crisis, if a society relies purely on private ownership and localized capital, the historical default is that the wealthy will inevitably hoard resources.
Of course.
The merchants will warehouse the grain, wait for the prices to skyrocket, and the masses will simply starve to death in the streets. Yusuf abolished that flawed, fatal system of private hoarding. The centralization wasn't a power grab just for the sake of tyranny. It was the creation of a massive state-run insurance policy.
It was mathematical.
It was a rational, highly centralized distribution network designed with the singular goal to mathematically guarantee that not a single person within the borders of the Egyptian state would die of starvation.
It is a radical trade-off, though. It's like saying you forfeit your private capital, your surplus wealth, and your localized land rights to the central authority. In exchange, the state removes the existential anxiety of survival. The state guarantees you will live.
And this brings us to a profound concept that the source extrapolates from the text, the idea of social physics.
I love this part.
Think of macroeconomic stability like gravity.
Sure.
When you establish a rational, centrally managed system of rububiyat that effectively guarantees the survival of its people, it creates an overwhelming geopolitical gravitational pull.
It's such a great concept because all around Egypt, you have these neighboring societies, tribal systems, localized fiefdoms, nomadic groups. They don't have a Yusuf.
They don't have a Hafizun Alim.
Exactly. They have flawed, deeply localized systems.
And when a 7-year drought hits, what happens to a localized tribal system? It collapses almost immediately. They have no strategic reserves, their private hoarding mechanisms fail, their people begin to starve. And according to the laws of social physics, a collapsing, starving population will inevitably, inexorably, be pulled into the orbit of the nearest rational, resource-secure superpower. They have no choice. The gravity of survival pulls them in.
It's imperial expansion without firing a single arrow. Egypt becomes the undeniable center of the world, not through military conquest, but because they are literally the only institution holding the keys to human survival.
The gravity is irresistible.
And that gravitational pull, that exact unavoidable social physics, is what sets the stage for the arrival of our main characters. It pulls a desperate, starving tribe out of Canaan across the desert and drops them right at the doorstep of Yusuf's sprawling, bureaucratic machine.
Yeah, the famine hits Canaan, and it hits the family of Jacob, or Yaqub, incredibly hard. The localized tribal economy has completely failed, so the patriarch tells his sons that there is grain in Egypt, an operational distribution center.
So they packed up.
The brothers travel to the capital to beg for sustenance. They are brought before the high official in charge of the global grain reserves. Yusuf looks at them, and he recognizes them immediately. but they have absolutely no idea who he is.
This is the moment where we have to fundamentally reboot how we visualize this story. Erase the painting of long-lost brothers locking eyes across a dusty room while dramatic music swells in the background.
It's not a Disney movie.
No, this is not a family reunion. This is a cold, hard study in international trade, sovereign leverage, and absolute staggering power disparity. The brothers represent a distressed, failing tribal economy coming to beg for a bailout at the feet of an institutional monolith. But let's pause on the recognition aspect. A lot of people read this and think, like, how could they not recognize their own brother? Did he have heavy Egyptian eye makeup on? A fake beard? Did he just age a lot?
It's a common question. But the physical changes are merely superficial elements of a much deeper cognitive reality. The source points out the profound psychological context of this encounter. We have to think about their mental framework, their schema. Decades ago, they committed an act of horrific, intimate violence. They threw a helpless, pleading, terrified young boy into a dark well.
Which is horrifying.
In their minds, that boy's narrative ended there. He was either dead at the bottom of that pit, or he was dragged off to live a short, brutal life as a wretched, nameless slave. That is the only file they have for Yusuf.
So it's a complete failure of schema. It's like, okay, if you bump into your dentist at a heavy metal concert, it takes your brain a minute to process who they are because they're entirely out of context.
That's a perfect analogy.
The brothers aren't just seeing a guy out of context, though. They are looking at the Secretary General of a global superpower. The man sitting on the dais in front of them commands the life and death of entire nations. He dictates macroeconomic policy. Their brains simply reject the mathematics required to connect helpless victim in a well with architect of global economics.
Doesn't compute.
Right. It is an asymmetric power dynamic of cosmic proportions. The two files in their brain cannot merge, so the brain just assumes this is a stranger.
The cognitive dissonance protects them from the reality. So they are standing there, vulnerable, starving foreigners, trying to negotiate with a towering state official who holds their entire tribe's survival in his ledger. And the most fascinating part of this encounter is how Yusuf reacts.
He doesn't skip a beat.
He doesn't leap off the throne and reveal himself. He doesn't break down weeping. He operates exactly as the chief economist of a rational state should operate. He engages them in trade. And he sets a standard in that very first transaction that leaves them completely shocked.
He establishes the terms of engagement right away. He says to the brothers, and I'm quoting the translation of Surah Yusuf 12.59 here, "Do you not see that I give full measure and that I am the best of hosts?" Now, if you read that quickly, I give full measure and am the best of hosts. It's not like he's just fishing for a good Yelp review. Like, great portions, excellent service, 5 stars.
Yeah, but we are talking about a macroeconomic architect here. Every word is a calculated policy statement.
Exactly.
If we do a linguistic deep dive into the concept of full measure in the ancient world, its significance becomes massive. Ancient cross-border trade was inherently chaotic. It was completely riddled with grift, shortchanging, rigged scales, and arbitrary barter.
Total Wild West.
If you were a desperate foreigner coming into a new land to buy grain, especially during a catastrophic famine where demand infinitely outstrips supply, you expected to be extorted. Knowing the local merchants were going to put a heavy thumb on the scale. You expected to trade your life savings for a half-empty sack of grain.
Because what are you going to do? Call the ancient Better Business Bureau. You're a foreigner. You have 0 rights.
Exactly. There's no recourse. So by explicitly highlighting to these foreign buyers that he gives the full measure, Yusuf is establishing a mathematically sound, corruption-free economic standard. He is broadcasting the institutional integrity of the Egyptian state. He is telling them that his scales are perfectly balanced, his ledgers are clean, and his system does not rely on petty extortion to generate wealth.
It's like a nation establishing the gold standard or positioning its currency as the global reserve. He's looking at these disparate, untrusting tribal groups and saying, you can trust our math. The projection of soft power here is brilliant. By showing absolute, verifiable, mathematical fairness to desperate people, Egypt cements its reputation as the ultimate, trustworthy economic hub of the world.
It is the ultimate projection of institutional trust. The source material emphasizes this standard of precise weights and measures as a core tenet of a righteous macroeconomy. When you guarantee the full measure, you eliminate the friction of distrust that usually slows down or destroys international trade.
It speeds everything up.
The brothers are shocked because they came in expecting to be fleeced, expecting to be victims of a bureaucratic shakedown. Instead, they are met with precise, undeniable institutional fairness. It disarms them completely.
But that structural integrity is exactly what sets up the trap. Because while he's giving them grain and proving the absolute purity of his ledgers, he is simultaneously setting up a highly sophisticated psychological operation.
Right, he's playing the long game.
He isn't just sending them home with full bellies and a receipt.
Yeah.
Before he signs off on their departure, he introduces a massive complication.
He begins to turn the gears of a much larger strategy. This brings us to what the text refers to as the engine of reason and the mechanics of a state-level intelligence operation.
Before he lets the brothers leave, Yusuf issues a terrifying ultimatum. He demands that the next time they return to Egypt for grain, they must bring their youngest brother Benjamin from their father. And he is incredibly blunt about the consequences. He says, "If you do not bring him to me, there will be no measure of grain for you from me, nor will you approach me."
It's a hard line.
He is looking at a group of men whose entire civilization is starving, and he says, "Bring me this specific boy, or I will cut off your food supply and let you all die."
From the traditional soap opera perspective, we look at this and think, oh, Yusuf just really misses his little brother Benjamin and wants to see his face. But from the perspective of statecraft, this is a highly calculated, ruthless intelligence-gathering operation.
It's not about nostalgia.
No. Yusuf is the head of a rational state. He is dealing with a foreign tribe that he knows, from deep personal traumatic experience, to be morally compromised. Decades ago, this group of men was perfectly willing to murder a favored younger brother out of pure, unadulterated jealousy.
But I want to push back on the morality of this tactic for a second. I mean, holding the global food supply hostage, using starvation as leverage to force a family to hand over a child, it sounds like the actions of a tyrant, not a benevolent economist. It feels like a massive violation of the very rububiyat, the guaranteed sustenance we were just praising him for.
I get that. It absolutely feels ruthless if you view it through the lens of modern interpersonal morality, where every interaction is supposed to be kind and accommodating, but you have to view it through the leverage of a rational state managing a global crisis.
Okay, so state versus individual morality.
Right. The source highlights a fundamental principle of international relations. A state engaging in trade or aid must know if the actors they are dealing with are trustworthy. Yusuf has limited resources, even with the surplus. If he's going to integrate this Canaanite tribe into his economic ecosystem, he has to know who they are today.
So he's stress testing a distressed asset. The Canaanite tribe is a distressed asset begging for a bailout, and Yusuf is the central bank doing due diligence.
That is the perfect analogy. He is conducting a rigorous, high-stakes test of their current societal integrity. Have they evolved? Has their society reformed its internal justice system? Or are they still fundamentally corrupted?
Will they repeat the past?
If a crisis hits, will they protect the vulnerable members of their society represented by the youngest brother, Benjamin? Or will they throw him to the wolves to save their own skins, just like they did with Yusuf? He needs hard data.
Yeah.
He needs intelligence on their moral and societal cohesion before he decides if they are a viable long-term partner or a liability that will rot his system from the inside.
He essentially creates a trolley problem for them. You can save yourselves, but only if you risk this boy. And to ensure that they actually engage with this trolley problem, to ensure they don't just try to find grain from some other failing state or simply refuse to ever return to Egypt out of fear, Yusuf executes what might be my favorite detail in the entire historical record.
Oh, it's brilliant.
He deploys a brilliant piece of economic subterfuge.
He sets an economic psychological trap.
So the grain is loaded onto their pack animals. The transaction is seemingly complete. But Yusuf secretly orders his servants to take the brothers' bida at their capital, the money or barter goods they brought to pay for the grain, and slip it right back into their saddlebags.
Just hides it in there.
The brothers leave Egypt completely unaware. It isn't until they are miles away, back home in Canaan, and they open their bags to distribute the food, that they find their entire fortune sitting right there on top of the grain.
We really have to unpack the brilliance of this trap because it operates on multiple levels. The expert linguistic analysis in the source text does a phenomenal breakdown of the word used for their returned goods, bida'at.
Yeah, it's not just pocket change.
No, this isn't just loose change. The root of the word is closely tied to essential household provisions, foundational wealth, or even a dowry, the Ayahs. It represents the core financial security of their tribe. By giving them the life-saving grain and secretly returning their foundational capital, Yusuf creates an unresolved ledger.
And an unresolved ledger is absolute poison to the human psyche.
It drives us crazy.
The psychological weight of unreciprocated gifts is massive. Think about the anthropologist Marcel Mauss and his theory of the gift. If someone gives you something of immense value and refuses to accept payment, they haven't just done you a favor. They have asserted dominance and created a binding obligation.
You owe them.
Right. If a friend buys me a coffee, I feel a slight nagging social pressure to buy the next round. But if the Secretary General of a foreign superpower gives my starving nation a fortune in grain and secretly slips my millions of dollars back into my briefcase, I am suddenly deeply, existentially indebted to that institution.
Psychologically, the brothers are now captured by the Egyptian state. They didn't earn the grain. It was a unilateral, overwhelming grant. But beyond the psychology, think about the political leverage this gives the brothers back home.
Oh, with their dad.
Right. They have to convince their heartbroken, highly skeptical father, Yaqub, to let Benjamin go back to Egypt. Yaqub absolutely does not want to do this because the last time he let a favored younger son go off with these brothers, the boy came back, quote-unquote, eaten by a wolf. He has zero trust in them.
But the brothers now have the ultimate, undeniable economic argument. They can empty the saddlebags on the table and say, look, Dad, our money was returned to us. This Egyptian leader isn't some extortionist tyrant. He is incredibly generous and honest.
The proof is right there.
We have an unresolved debt of honor to the most powerful man in the world. We have to go back to pay our debts, and we desperately need more food. But we can only unlock that food if we bring Benjamin. The capital proves the leader's goodwill.
It forces the father's hand completely.
It's the ultimate freemium model, but with literal geopolitical stakes.
I love that. The freemium model.
Think about how a tech company hooks you. They give you the software for free, you build your whole life or business around it, and then once you are entirely dependent on their ecosystem, they introduce the premium tier, and you have no choice but to pay. Yusuf gave them a massive grant, a free trial of Egyptian prosperity and absolute survival. But now they are locked in.
They're in the ecosystem.
They have no choice but to return to the negotiating table, and they have to do it entirely on Yusuf's terms, bringing the intelligence asset Benjamin that he demanded.
And this micro-interaction with the brothers, this subtle manipulation of capital, debt, and psychology to force compliance and gather societal intelligence, it perfectly reflects the macro philosophy of Yusuf's entire worldview. Everything he does is about managing a ledger of responsibilities. Yusuf does not deal in unearned rights. He deals in reciprocal obligations.
Which brings us to the philosophical climax of the source material. Because the text takes this rigorous historical analysis of Yusuf's administration and uses it as a launchpad for a really sharp, profound critique of the modern world.
It really shifts gears here.
It does. Specifically, it critiques the modern wage earner system. It contrasts our current global economic anxieties with the worldview engineered by Yusuf. And the core argument the text makes is that modern society has become completely pathologically obsessed with demanding rights.
And just to be clear, the analysis traces a historical evolution here. We moved from an era of the divine right of kings, where monarchs demanded unquestioned authority, to a modern era characterized by the divine rights of the masses. Today, the political and economic discourse is entirely dominated by the language of rights.
Everything is a right.
Everyone is shouting about their right to a living wage, their right to a fair share, their right to better conditions. But the text argues that in this cacophony of demanding rights, we have almost entirely ignored the foundational concept of responsibilities.
It breaks down the modern wage system as inherently adversarial. If you look at how we survive today, the relationship between the worker and the state or the worker and the corporation is basically a perpetual battle.
It's exhausting.
You have to unionize, you have to strike, you have to collectively bargain, you have to constantly negotiate just to secure a basic baseline living wage so your family doesn't fall into poverty. The entire burden of securing sustenance is placed squarely on the individual's ability to aggressively extract capital from the system.
And that creates a society defined by constant, exhausting friction. Every economic transaction, every labor contract is a battle for a slightly larger slice of the pie. It breeds immense anxiety. But the text argues that in the system Yusuf built, as interpreted through these ancient sources, that paradigm is completely inverted.
Because in Yusuf's Egypt, you don't have to strike or fight a corporation for a basic wage just to survive the famine.
No. The state has already centralized that burden.
Right. The state's fundamental mathematical obligation, that concept of rububiyat we discussed earlier, the guarantee of basic sustenance, is already locked in.
Exactly. The state ensures that you have food, shelter, and the baseline necessities of life, regardless of your negotiating power. Because that baseline survival is structurally guaranteed by the government, the citizen's psychological focus is entirely freed from the primal anxiety of starving.
You aren't operating in survival mode.
And when you remove the anxiety of survival, human focus naturally shifts toward fulfilling their societal responsibilities.
So, if I am synthesizing this correctly, in our modern system, we view survival as a right that we must constantly fight for and demand from those in power. But in Yusuf's system, the right to survival isn't something you demand. It is simply the natural, automatic, systemic outcome of the responsibility being fulfilled.
It's a byproduct.
The state fulfills its overarching responsibility of rububiyat, and the citizen, freed from panic, fulfills their responsibility of labor, innovation, and contribution to the society.
The source material argues that when a society focuses only on demanding rights without a foundational state-level guarantee of sustenance, it leads to endless conflict, inflation, and societal degradation.
Both kinds of inflation.
Right. Both economic inflation, where the money loses value, and social inflation, where trust and cohesion lose value. But imagine a society designed by a chief economist who understands both human psychology and macroeconomics.
It would look so different.
By mathematically guaranteeing the baseline of survival through centralized resource management, you free up massive amounts of human capital. People aren't working meaningless, soul-crushing jobs just to avoid starving. They're working to build, to innovate, to fulfill a larger societal role. The friction is removed from the ledger.
It is a stunning reframing of how we think about ancient history. I mean, when most of us look back at ancient Egypt, the immediate mental image is one of brutal slavery masses of people being whipped while dragging stone blocks to build pyramids for megalomaniacal pharaohs.
That's the pop culture image.
But this textual analysis suggests an entirely different era, an era under Yusuf characterized by radical state-sponsored welfare, a system where the guarantee of full measure and basic sustenance was the actual engine that drove the superpower's dominance.
The welfare was the power.
The idea of a society where the baseline of survival is mathematically guaranteed, freeing human capital to simply do the work they are meant to do, it sounds like a utopian concept from a progressive science fiction novel, but the source is extracting it directly from a millennia-old text.
And it forces us to deeply question our own assumptions about the trajectory of human progress. Have our modern economic systems truly evolved to be more humane and advanced? Or have we simply localized and privatized the anxiety of survival?
We've just shifted the burden.
Yusuf looked at a starving world and centralized the anxiety. He took the agonizing burden of survival off the shoulders of the vulnerable individual and placed it squarely onto the ledgers of the state. He demanded only one thing in return, that those ledgers be managed with absolute, incorruptible integrity and unparalleled technical brilliance.
This has been a massive journey today. We started with a story that most of us thought we knew by heart. A familiar, emotionally comforting Sunday school tale of a boy thrown in a well, a family drama driven by jealousy, hardship, and an eventual tearful reunion.
It's a soap opera.
Right. But by stripping away the soap opera and diving into the raw mechanics of the text, we found something infinitely more complex. We discovered a rigorous, ancient blueprint for international trade. We saw the geopolitical power of establishing corruption-free ledgers through the guarantee of the full measure.
It changes everything.
And we explored the fascinating social physics of rububiyat, where a state's commitment to guaranteed sustenance creates an undeniable gravitational pull.
We examined how a true state architect operates, how Yusuf utilized intelligence gathering and brilliant economic psychological traps like returning the foundational capital to the brothers' saddlebags, not out of petty malice or a desire for revenge, but as the calculated necessary leverage of a rational state stress testing a deeply distressed asset.
He wasn't just reacting, he was engineering.
Exactly. Yusuf wasn't just a passive survivor of a tragic childhood. He was the chief economist who engineered a global superpower through the perfect, incredibly rare fusion of Hafiz's unyielding moral integrity and Alim's supreme technical expertise.
It completely rewrites the narrative for me, and I suspect for anyone listening, you will never read those ancient verses the same way again. It shifts the entire foundation from the emotional to the structural. And this structural view of history completely reframes how we must look at our own modern society, because it forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question about the world we live in today.
It really does. If we look at Yusuf's economic standard, It demanded that he give the full measure to absolutely everyone. He provided guaranteed sustenance even to desperate, vulnerable foreign strangers who had fundamentally, violently wronged him in the past.
His abusers, essentially.
Right. His system was impartial, mathematically sound, and designed to preserve human life above all other considerations. Look at our global supply chains, our international trade agreements, and our domestic economic policies today.
Right now.
If a catastrophic 7-year global crisis hit tomorrow, a true unavoidable famine of resources, whether agricultural, technological, or financial, would our current systems pass Yusuf's stress test? Would our institutions prioritize the full measure of human sustenance, guaranteeing rububiyyat for the most vulnerable? Or would they immediately default to the localized hoarding of private capital, leaving the distressed and the marginalized to starve while the elites secure their own silos? Who, in our modern world, is actually acting as the chief economist?
That is a chilling but absolutely necessary question to leave you with. We have to look at our own ledgers. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you think you know. Keep looking for the hidden structures behind the ancient legends, and we will see you next time.